All right. Well, welcome to the future of work data-driven design. My name is Max Chapovsky. I help companies around the country find and negotiate the leases for their office space, ensuring that the space they have is the space they need and reflects and supports their company culture. The Future of Work is a series exploring our evolving relationship with work, how, where, and why, the trends in tech disrupting and improving the workplace, and perspectives from thought leaders on our new normal. Today, we're going to talk about space design. The interesting thing about design is that it's always been fairly linear, right? The architect takes the tenant through a programming exercise, determines the amount of space and the types of amenities, and after a couple of test fits, you get into schematic design, design development, finally construction drawings, pretty standard. But what if it didn't have to be so linear? What if you could prototype a proposed design, get user feedback, and then move forward? It's kind of like applying the lean startup concept of an MVP, minimum viable product, to interior design. So you create smaller scale but fully functional prototypes to collect data from your users, and with that feedback, design a space that people will actually use. If that sounds crazy, let me remind you of last week's spectacular explosion of the SpaceX Starship Super Heavy rocket, just a few minutes after liftoff. That launch was actually a learning experience, and although it was worth tens of millions of dollars to Elon Musk and his team, they collected a ton of data that they are going to use to launch the next iteration. Now, most companies do not have billions in cash, nor do they collect data by blowing up rockets. Office build-outs are expensive as it is, and prototyping is usually cost, space, and time prohibitive. But one firm did do it. NI, formerly National Instruments, was ready to embark on a redesign of its Austin HQ in 2019. They hired Gensler, and then COVID hit. So they decided to step back and rethink the identity of the office altogether, and the result was the Workplace Pilot Program. Some of what they found was expected, and some was nothing short of a revelation. Today, we're going to hear from two people who led the project for NI and Gensler. Scott Strzinek is the Senior Director of Global Facilities at NI and leads a team managing over 2 million square feet of space across 70 locations in 25 countries, supporting 7,000 employees. His innovative approach to global corporate renovations has garnered praise from clients and industry accolades, including recognition from the American Institute of Architects, Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, and Austin Business Journal. Scott's true passion lies in collaborating with industry professionals to shape the future of work. By aligning space and culture, he crafts exceptional global workplace experiences that not only enhance employee engagement, but also foster a sense of belonging, enabling organizations to attract and retain top talent. Kelly Moore is the strategy leader for the South Central region at Gensler, where she collaborates with clients to implement design experience solutions built on a framework of strategy and research. Her clients are often undergoing transformation and seeking change in their work models and new strategies for how the workplace can catapult their teams to success. For over 20 years, she has helped global clients develop and implement workplace strategy and design to achieve their organizational goals and enhance the overall employee experience. Scott and Kelly, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Scott, let's start with you. Describe the project and why you embarked on it and why you chose now to embark on it. And by now, I mean when you started the project.
Sure. So NI is a 45-year-old tech company based in Austin, Texas. We're on a large campus, it's 70 acres. We Our building footprint is about 750,000 square feet. Um, we originally built the space 25 years ago, and in 2019 it was 22 years old. So it was time for a renovation. And like most space, it was designed for the function in the moment, and lots has changed over the years, over the decades. So in 2019, we decided to do a full campus renovation, and then, like you said, COVID hit, and I thought for sure it was going to totally derail it. But we worked with Gensler, and Kelly and her team were magical and were able to do this workplace strategy engagement completely virtually, which I thought was impossible.
Yeah.
But she was able to pull that off, and And after that took off, I knew that I was with, an amazing design team.
Magical is probably the biggest compliment you can make to any partner. So, uh, Kelly, I'm excited to hear your perspective on this. Before we jump into that, though, I do want to talk a little bit about the impact of the pandemic on your real estate needs. So obviously that changed for everybody, Scott. But what did that do to your real estate needs, and how did it impact your employee attendance?
So, the pandemic hit, and we had a mandate in Austin that we could only have critical personnel no more than 10%. So everyone went home except for a few critical staff. These were the maintenance teams that were running the buildings and some essential engineers. Everyone else worked from home. And it was, I think most people experienced, if you were in the office during that time, it was spooky.
Yeah.
We had all sorts of protocols and masking and thermal imaging and all the things to make sure that we were safe. But essentially, our real estate was empty, and I think we all thought that this was going to be relatively temporary or short term. Maybe not put a time frame on it, but we just assumed that, okay, once this is over, we're going to come back to work. And so the initial impact to our real estate was really minimal. We kind of kept business as usual from a real estate standpoint. We did some renovations. We did lease renewals. We moved a few places, and so we kind of acted like it was normal until 2 years into it. Then we realized, oh, this is not a temporary thing.
Yeah.
So it was a strange time for sure, because we kind of acted like we were going to get back to normal.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you started this project on this long journey of going back to normal, how did you ensure that you were getting a wide representation of employee perspectives, is actually getting input from your users without having too many cooks in the kitchen?
So this is like from a design perspective, right?
Yes. So as you were trying to get input on the design process, you obviously wanted to make sure that you were taking into account what your people were doing, how they were using the space. But if
Yes,
you have too many perspectives, it slows things down, and it's hard to please everybody. It's impossible to please everybody. So
totally.
so how'd you do that?
So we initially started. We didn't go straight into the design process. We started with this workplace strategy engagement, and that's where we engaged Kelly and her team. And um, the summary of that engagement is that we learned how we work and how we want to work in the future.
Hmm.
And that's actually a complex process. You have to understand who is in your office, what the teams are, how many people there are. I didn't know we had 26 teams across campus, and each one of them had very unique needs. And so the workplace strategy engagement helped define all of those different requirements. And Kelly, if you want to go more into the workplace strategy engagement, because that was really the essential starting point for this whole process.
Yeah, and I mean, you all had also surveyed your employees right before we came on board. So it was a matter of taking that information and that research that you all had already done and really coupling it with starting to engage stakeholders, from a leadership level, but also diving in deep to the organization and doing workshops and understanding, as Scott said, what people do, what they were doing in their current state before everybody was sent home, and starting over time. As we realized, we weren't going back to work in June, and we weren't going back to work in September, and we weren't going back the following year. What were the expectations kind of over that time? Right. So it was just, continuing to engage them to understand how expectations shifted from how they used to work to what those expectations would be when they return to work, and continually understanding how their work might change, and changing the strategy of what that might be realized in space. And I think that that's really when we realized that a pilot was a good idea. Instead of saying, this is how a future campus should look, stepping back and saying, let's experiment and learn kind of in flight, in real time, what we can experiment with and learn from the people versus taking it to a larger scale.
Was this the first time that you used this kind of process with experimentation, Kelly?
It was for me. And it wasn't something that we saw a lot of clients doing before the pandemic. But we see a lot of clients moving to that now. And it just seems like a smarter way of doing business. And I think that that's something that Scott's seen a lot of value out of as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's almost an obvious approach. And I've done hundreds of renovations in my career, and this is the first time I've ever done it too. But if it makes sense to try something at a small scale before you make this huge investment on a large scale. You want to make sure that you get it right, and the piloting process does that. And so it seems obvious now that we've done it, but it's a pretty unique process.
And I think what was also really nice about the pilot is, as we were designing it, it's not just a design that you complete the design and you execute it and somewhat deliver it to the end users, but we were actually engaging the end users in workshops and co-creating that design. So you're bringing those users along on the design journey, and that's not always the case. And to me, that's probably what makes that whole process the most unique. And really, it creates buy-in from the users, and they get excited about it and they're part of it. So while you have, this whole anxiety around returning to the office after all of this time at home, you're somewhat tempering that because you've brought these users on the journey of co-creating what that future is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a wonderful approach, because if somebody feels like they're a part of decision-making process, then they just inherently are more engaged in the solution, right?
Right.
For sure.
So Scott, as you sort of were going through this process, what were you finding about your space utilization, especially during, call it the initial discovery? What were you finding, and did any of it surprise you?
Well, our space utilization just changed. We went from, historically, work is where you go.
Yeah.
Right. You do work in the office, but now work is what you do. And so through the pandemic, we were both equipped and socialized to work anywhere. So for the first time ever, the office had competition.
Yeah.
If you don't have a mandate, it's really important to compel people back to the office, and that's what I believe that my role is in a company, is to compel people, to create an environment, not to force them to come back to the office, but to create a center of gravity that's so strong that it is their best place to work. It was an unusual shift. It was an unexpected shift. I think for everyone to have work is what you do, not where you go.
So let's drill down on that for a minute. So how did you then redefine the role of the office as the center of gravity, and how is this reflected in its design?
So because we have choice now, we really need to create an environment that has purpose. And the way to do that, this workplace strategy engagement, sort of the process that we went through with Gensler, really we dug deep to understand how people work, exactly what they're doing, when they come to the office, what they're doing in the office. And if you think about your day, you could start a day having a stand-up meeting with a team, and then you could have a virtual meeting. Maybe you've got some people in a room and people on the screen. You need some heads down time for emails. You need some quiet space. You need to have a place to eat lunch. Maybe you need to call your spouse or your doctor, so you need a privacy there. You could have a large conference room full of people, and then maybe you want to have some celebration at the end of the day. Like that's one day for one person. You have all these different activities, and one space type is really not going to enable all of those activities. So they really, if you really dig deep and understand how your employees work, and then you deliver a space or a variety of spaces that enable that work, that really creates that gravity to where it becomes the best place for them. There's also a technology layer that's incredibly important, right?
Yeah.
So you have all these spaces, but I use the example of, like, it wasn't that long ago where if you wanted to go see a movie, especially if it was like a premiere, and you wanted to have a good experience in that movie, you wanted to sit, right in the middle, you had to show up an hour early, right? And stand in line and make sure that you got there before everyone else, right? And it's stressful. It used to drive me crazy. But that's how you did it. There was all this friction that led up to that moment to where you're, rush into the best seat. If you have technology tools, that really reduces the friction. So you have things like, great Wi-Fi, great collaboration tools, conference room booking tools, hotel desk booking tools if you're hoteling, even online tools to order lunch. Like, all of those tools, especially as you start to layer them, it really reduces the friction, it reduces the stress. And if you know that you're going to have all the spaces you need to do your best work, that's going to be the place that you choose. So the technology is a big, important layer to it.
So, so Kelly, from your perspective, you got these requirements from Scott and his team at NI about the different kinds of spaces, some of the technology requirements. What were your next steps at that point? How did you translate that into at least the initial ideas of the design?
Yeah, so it was taking a look and, also realizing that there's the pilot, but it's looking at what is the entire ecosystem, at a campus level, what will be provided, at a building level, what will be provided, at a floor level, at a neighborhood level, and then understanding what's the balance of spaces that we provide. And then how does it start to support the individual groups? So whether that's, an engineering and development group, or whether that's an administrative and business group, and really starting to work with those groups. For instance, like their R&D group operates very differently than an administrative or business group. So what are the spaces or the neighborhoods and the space types and the makeup of space types that they need to support them? And so how do we experiment with those? And it even comes down to the desking, and the desking being very different for an R&D group than an administrative type group. So how do we start to experiment with those things and support them and lay out those spaces to support them? I think it was also talking about what are some behavioral shifts that need to change. I think that's been a big conversation topic across organizations of, as we move back into space, what are some of those behavioral shifts that need to change, especially if we're looking at desks that aren't necessarily assigned, and we're looking at a lot of increased focus spaces, ensuring that people don't go and squat in those focus spaces all day, that they're available for, those people that need to step in for respite from the open workspace, or make a call to a doctor or a spouse, as Scott was mentioning. So I'd be curious to know from Scott, how much behavioral shift, and did that seem to take a long time within the pilot space for teams to kind of change and shift a little bit?
It's a great question.
Yeah. I think initially we had some people, it seemed like it was the more senior, the people, the
Yeah.
worse the behavior almost. And
Right.
I say that respectfully to any of the senior folks that are listening to this. But it's really easy to go into a room that's warm and inviting, and it has the tools you need, and it's got the acoustics, and it's private and stuff. It's so easy to like put your stuff down, especially if you're traveling.
And
If you're
stay a
traveling to that
while.
office, yeah,
Yeah.
and to just camp out there all day. But what you're doing is you're taking away resources for the rest of the company, the rest of the folks, and so it became almost self-monitoring and self-regulating. We empowered our residents of our pilot space to speak up when we saw people kind of breaking the rules, and we actually in facilities did sort of an education campaign to help people understand the purpose of each one of the spaces. And like we had a space called the library, and it was intended to be no phones, no talking,
Hmm.
none of that. And we had signs on the great graphics on the at the door as you go in to help convey that in sort of a cool engineering way, that this is a quiet space. And so throughout the introduction of the pilot, each one of our spaces kind of had a different purpose, and you have to you have to teach your employees what those purposes are, and then they kind of settle in. Because if this space doesn't work for them, well, you've got other spaces that will.
Yeah, it's almost like change management, it becomes a big part of the process. And not only
For
that,
sure.
but education kind of goes hand in hand with it. And once you get to the point of self-regulation, you are really fundamentally shifting behaviors in the long run. It's like if you compare the American culture to the Japanese culture, for example, right? In the American culture, it's very individualistic. And if people, again, I'm speaking in very general terms, see a
Yeah.
conference room that's designed for 12 people, but it's the first one they see and they're in town and they're tired and they just want to sit, they sit down, right? Because it's easiest for them.
Right.
But in the Japanese culture, for example, that person would say, well, where should I go? Right? And if I don't know what resources are there for me to understand where I should go and how is this going to benefit the team versus myself? So the fact that you're getting to the point or have gotten to the point where people have shifted their thinking so significantly as to be able to consider the team first, that in and of itself is a victory of the design, you know? What I'd like to know is when we've thought about metrics historically, metrics to establish real estate needs were pretty simple. Square footage per person, and
Hmm.
you run that through, maybe a filter of how many common spaces are you going to have. Now I feel like there's additional filters of how many of those people, how much of your head count is even located around your headquarters, so is actually going to go into the office, and how many of them might have moved across the country. And then of those people that are local, how many of them are in the office, and how many of them are in the office on enough days to warrant a dedicated workspace. So it's become a lot more complicated. So I'm curious, in this scenario, and this is for both of you, what metrics were used to establish your real estate needs in terms of the footprint, and why did you focus on those metrics?
Kelly, you want to start?
Yeah, and for the pilot, I mean, I can't really speak to that because we were just moving a few teams in and out there, right? And then in all transparency, I am not sure how we then applied it to the rest of the campus. I can say outside of NI, like what we're starting to see is how do we start to weigh different work points outside of the desk. So, one, understanding, to your point, Max, what you were saying, of does everybody get an assigned desk based on how often they're in the office?
Mm-hmm.
And then also, how do we start to weigh alternate work points and understanding how well they might support dwell time? So, for instance, if I'm only in the office 2 days a week, are there alternate work points that I can go to when I am in the office? And so I don't need an assigned desk. And how many of those alternate work points do we provide that can support me from a focus or collaboration standpoint based on how long I might dwell at them? So there are all different ways that we're starting to program space and understand outside of an individual desk what we need to provide. It's programming in a whole different way than what we were doing prior to the pandemic, which is very interesting. But Scott, if you want to talk about how you all are approaching it from a campus-wide standpoint.
Yeah. Well, historically it was pretty easy.
Yeah.
It's a multiplier, right? You figure out the square foot, a square foot per person, and that's your footprint. All that blew up. So in this process that we went through with Gensler, they introduced us to the concept of work modes, and we took that as our inspiration to create an initiative that we call Workplace for Everyone. And the WFE initiative had a lot of different components to it, but one thing it did was it introduced and socialized work modes into NI, and essentially those modes were on-site, hybrid, and remote. We had 3 work modes. Everyone had to self-declare what their work mode was, and it was approved by their manager. And some of it made sense. It was obvious. Like if you're a manufacturing worker, if you're on the production line, you're an on-site worker, right? But others, there was some flexibility there. And basically what we did was we defined on-site as 80 to 100% in the office. Hybrid was 20% to 80%. So, 1 to 4 days, 2 to 4 days. And remote was 1 to 0. And what that did was that helped set expectations all around of how people were going to work, where they were going to work. And what it's done for me and my team is it helps inform us how big offices are going to be, because we know everyone's work mode, so we can we generally understand what a hybrid worker looks like. And we've got roughly 2/3 of our employees, 65% are hybrid workers. They don't all need a dedicated desk all the time. We've given guidance that if you're here 3 days a week, you're probably eligible for a full-time desk, but otherwise you'll have a hoteling desk. That starts to shift what our footprint of space looks like. It also changes the activities that happen there. Like if I'm there 1 or 2 days a week, I'm probably not going to be sitting at my desk 100% of the time, right? I come to collaborate. I come to use all the tools that are at our disposal. I'm up and about in different rooms, different space types all day. So I don't need a dedicated desk. But what I do need is I need all those different space types that we talked about earlier. So it shifts the way that we design space, not only from a desk to person ratio, but it also shifts the design to ensure that we incorporate all those space types that we need now.
Now, do you sublease some of that space or somehow get rid of the space that you're not using, or do you reconfigure it to reflect the way that people are working?
Both. So we another metric that we use outside of the work modes is attendance data from our access control system. So this is badge data. And badge data is really important because we found if we ask somebody how many people are in the office on a given day, it seems to be very different than what the data demonstrates, right?
Perception versus reality.
Yep.
That's right. That's right. And there's different motivations why that happens, but there's definitely a delta between the two. So the our badge data is really the primary source of truth, and we ensure that you sort of have to badge in to ensure that we capture that. It's all aggregate data, right? But that tells us what our utilization is. And so what we've done over time is we take the utilization, and if we have a really big office with a super low attendance rate that seems to be a long-term pattern, it's time to put some sunshine on that
Yeah.
and to really rationalize that office or do something with it. And we do space reductions. Sometimes we'll transition out of a lease into a co-working space, and then other times we'll close the office.
Now, did you ever, because there are some companies where I've heard of this happening, so I'm curious how it has sort of gone down culturally at NI. Were there any cases of managers or higher leadership being concerned about productivity, given that a lot more people can work from home and are either hybrid or remote first? Did you see any of that? And if so, how was it addressed? How did it shake out?
I don't think it was productivity. Um, I think it was more culture.
Hmm.
I think the longer you're away from everyone, the more your culture can erode, unless you have a really strong, vibrant way of maintaining your culture
Hmm.
virtually, which is tough, right? The office is really the center of the enterprise that is a place that really demonstrates the culture
Hmm.
in a physical form. And so I think that was more of a concern than it was productivity. We were able to have record revenue during the pandemic. So clearly, from a metric standpoint, productivity wasn't really an issue.
Yeah, I love that you go to hard numbers because, if
Yeah,
people can get it done from anywhere, who cares if they're in the office, besides obviously the impact on culture.
yeah.
Kelly, I want to go to you for a
Yeah.
minute. So, when we think about some of the designs that are being done today, whether it's NI or some of your other clients, what trends are you seeing? What design trends are you seeing in the sort of broader office market that are new and maybe the products of the last few years of sort of these shifting norms in the way we work?
Yeah. So definitely what we've been talking about, new ways of planning and experimenting. And I think those things are here to stay. The last few years have given us agency to these ideas.
Hmm.
And some of it's been led by the increased uncertainties that organizations are having to anticipate and plan in wider ranges. So, whether that's uncertainties of the economy, the geopolitical natures of the climate. But I think some of this is also that in the last 2 years, we've become more empathetic and more aware that people work very differently,
Hmm.
even on a similar task. So it's no longer that one size fits all for everybody. So we're open to new ways of planning and creating new space types. So we're looking at planning with a different lens and understanding what spaces are working best for supporting our teams and our individuals and then taking them to scale. So I think that that's something that's really new and a trend that I think is here to stay. And then I think also the idea of measuring experience outcomes, such as So if we go back to metrics, outcomes is such as engagement, well-being, and equity. So a whole different set of metrics, if you will, versus just square foot per person. So in addition to those spatial metrics, we look at these metrics as success indicators for our clients that are allowing them to assess the performance of the workplace. It's this whole idea that the workplace, isn't just a place where you go, that it has to be this entire experience for when you're there. So it's lending itself to a whole new set of metrics that need to be assessed. And then, I would say a trend that's probably not going away is this idea that hybrid and flexibility won't stick. I think that that's something that's here to stay, and it's something that's wags real estate decisions, and that we have to be agile and smart in those decisions that we make around that.
Measuring experience outcomes is challenging and critical at the same time.
Right.
Like,
Totally.
it's fascinating. I write a newsletter for my clients, and the headline for Q1 was 2023 is the year of the experience. It's the experiential
Right.
year where that is what draws people out of their homes. It's what justifies the commute. It's what brings them together at the end of the day. What I want to know is, as you compare the space, the office space of 2023 to the office space of even 2019, let's just say, there has been so much innovation over the last few years. I mean, Scott, you talked about it earlier. Even in the midst of the pandemic, you had to innovate technologically to even make sure that the space was safe for those, 10% that came in. So I'm curious, Kelly, I'd love to get your perspective. If you think about design, furniture, prop tech, even AI, what innovations do you think are going to have some of the biggest impact on the office sector?
So I actually think of it, and it's more based because of what I do.
Don't
from
forget the
this.
mic.
Oh, yeah. I think of it more of innovation that maybe you can't see versus, tangible things like furniture and maybe design elements that you do see. And that probably comes from the lens of what I do, sitting more in a strategy world than a true design world, even though they intersect. But, I think of sensors and AI as something that really is going to propel forward in the design world. And it goes back to kind of that idea of measuring experience, right? So you think of sensors and AI, it gives us a whole new way of learning and measuring, but also managing business. Sensors is something that's been around, and people get a little funny when you start to talk about it, but it's something
I
that
have some
really
experience
can,
with that.
it's something that can really can give us so much information. And so, for instance, we have data analytics strategists that's the world they sit in, and they can take all of those insights, even from badging data that you think can be very simple data, but it can give us so much, and it can give us data in a very anonymous way, but it can tell us stories from these technologies and create models that allow us to inform our clients to improve experience while also aligning on business goals. And it can go really deep. And I think if we leverage those technologies, the sensors and AI, it can really lead us to different experiences that we create within the workplace. And I think in the past we haven't leveraged them, and I think that there's the ability to do that now. We're doing that with some clients, and the really rich information that comes out of them, of those stories, is really powerful.
Now, you mentioned stories, and Scott, judging by your reaction, I have a
He has
feeling
one.
you have a story about this sensor data. So tell us about that.
So I'm a data guy. I love it, and I think it's great, and it gives a lot of insight. I think the um, uh, the introduction of it is really important. The introduction of it into like how it's going to be used is incredibly important.
Hmm.
We This is probably 10 years ago. We installed sensors at people's desks. It was anonymous. We were looking for aggregate data. About a week later, I come in and I had a pile of sensors on my desk.
Amazing.
And those
you
were
know,
anonymous too, how they got there.
Totally, totally, totally. Yeah,
Right.
they weren't going to have it. I think that I'm not as attuned to the sensor technology presently. I'm sure it's come a long way since a decade ago.
Hmm.
But I love the concept because it's not just a badge swipe that says 100 people were in the office today, but it really starts to help inform us on what spaces are used, how much they're used, when they're used, and the more sensor technology and the more application of it, the better the data is that can inform you, and then you can start really getting incredible insights of what spaces are used or what aren't, and then you can start building towards that. So I love the concept. I just think you really have to socialize it appropriately, and because if you don't, you're going to end up with a bunch of technology on
On your
the
desk.
director's desk.
Sensors
Yeah,
on your desk. Yeah, totally.
yeah. Um,
Now,
I
go
would
ahead,
like to
Scott.
go back to one comment about the sort of the changes that are coming, because I think this is important. Kelly, you were talking about
Hmm.
some design change and stuff, and I think the focus on accommodations in the space, like um, not all of us are the same, and we have different health issues, and we have different religious issues, and we've got different all different kinds of things that make space work for some of us and not others.
Hmm.
And historically, what I've done, and I think most of us do when we build space, is we build it for the majority, and
The 80
everyone moves
versus the
in, and
20.
then yeah, exactly. We build it for the
Hmm.
80%, and then the 20% come in, and it just doesn't work for them, right? And
Yeah.
these are, it also, we sort of put everybody into an accommodations bucket. The folks that have migraines, or they're on the autism spectrum, or they need a place to give themselves injections, or they have some religious
Yeah.
um, accommodation, right? All those people are, obviously critically important to the company, and historically we have not incorporated them into the design process. It's always after the fact, and so you end up unscrewing light bulbs above certain desks, and you lower the
Yeah.
blinds, and you tell people to get injections in the restrooms, and
Hmm.
it's just a terrible solution for the 20%. What we did, thanks to Gensler, is we got together a group that we called NI Enable, and it was a group that represented all these folks that needed accommodations, and we brought them into the design process, and we had we got a really good understanding of what those accommodations were, and then we just built it into the design. And it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a big expense. Flicker free LED lights, for example,
Yeah.
or a space that somebody could go pray or meditate.
Yeah.
A place where they could have injections, diabetes injections or whatever the case may be.
Hmm.
And it was inexpensive. It solved a lot of issues that a typical um, renovation process would not even begin to address,
Yeah.
and we got a lot of really grateful employees because of it. So again, it's one of those things that seems obvious that you would always do that, but for whatever reason, it wasn't. And I'm just so grateful for Gensler and for introducing us to that concept.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think that comes from, you know, the last 2, 3 years. I mean, there's something about all of us going through the pandemic that I think, well-being was a trend prior to the pandemic. I think
Mhm.
the experience accelerated it all for us. And it's unfortunate that it took a pandemic for that to
Yeah.
happen, but it's very much it's not an add-on any longer, right? Well-being. It's very much something that is being included in the idea of inclusive design, and bringing in and making sure that our workplaces include neurodiverse accommodations
Hmm.
into the workplace is very important. I'll say the other thing quickly that I wanted to mention, that I think when you think what's the greatest impact on the office sector that you're asking, Max, is the other big conversation that we're having with clients is that of the idea of sustainability. And so if that sustainability from the sense of planning, from design, meaning like how can our strategies and our design be sustainable in the sense of long-term sustainable strategies and being smart and agile and flexible, but then even taking that to the sense of, how is it sustainable from a climate impact standpoint? We're having a lot of conversations around that. And sometimes it's challenging because I think when you start to talk about climate impact, everybody thinks that they have to be an expert if they're even going to talk about that subject,
Yeah.
because it's a very
Big.
challenging. It's a
Yeah,
big, and it has so many facets to it. And you start to
that's
talk
right.
about a lot of words that seem challenging, as far as like trying to be net zero, carbon neutral, trying to shrink our footprint. And so, I think that whole topic has a lot of impact when you think about the office sector. And so sometimes it's just starting with small shifts, from using the right materials to even introducing biophilia into the design solutions. But I think that's going to be one of the biggest impacts to the office sector as well.
I mean, gosh, the irony that the pandemic fast tracked a sense of empathy and helped us to recognize each other's humanity, and all of the office design implications and the cultural shifts that flow from that is hopefully not lost on anyone, because it certainly, cost us as the world a lot,
Too
right?
much, yeah.
Too much.
Yeah, for sure.
So we damn well better have a silver lining, you know?
Right.
So, well, thank you both so much for joining, Kelly Moore, strategy leader for the South Central region at Gensler, and Scott Strzinek, senior director of global facilities at NI. Really appreciate you joining and sharing your wisdom.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. For more information, visit our website where you'll find show notes, and the episode will be published on Spotify and Apple as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining the Future of Work, and we will talk to you next time.